Hello, I'm Jack Easton, and I'll be talking a little bit about week 3 of BIO461 and what we've learned this week. We're going to be talking a lot about the different nervous systems and the subdivisions of each nervous system and how they work and where they are and things like that. To start off, I've kind of wrote this out so that you can see it easy. Let me tilt this down. There's the central nervous system that is located in the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is like a messenger for the central nervous system. This peripheral nervous system splits into either somatic nervous system or autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system has, it is like lifting your arm. It's like voluntary, where somatic nervous system controls the voluntary movements. So like lifting your arm, going to the gym, working out. Autonomic nervous system does the opposite, like breathing, and you don't have things that you don't really have to think about, like involuntary things like having your heart beat and everything like that. Somatic nervous system has one neuron, and we're going to be drawing this out a lot more later, but the neurons kind of look like this. The autonomic nervous system has two neurons that branch into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The difference between these two, sympathetic nervous system is like fight or flight, so it activates like your heart rate raises when you are being chased by a bear. That's the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is rest or digest when you're eating your favorite food or sleeping, good stuff like that. So that is kind of the basics of the different nervous systems. We are now going to draw out the sympathetic or the central nervous system where its origin. We're going to draw out something called ganglia and the neurons and where the neurons go throughout the body just a little bit. And there's something that I will also draw out called neurotransmitters. Those are connected to different kinds of receptors that basically send messages down our neurons for our brain to tell us to do specific things, all the way down to our toes and our arms and things like that. So I'm going to be drawing this out a little bit. That will kind of help us understand how our nerves and neurons work. To explain a little bit, our nerves are made up of neurons. So that might make neurons make a little bit more sense. Okay, so it all starts in one of our vertebrae, and I'm going to kind of draw that out kind of big. Help you understand. There's something called white matter and gray matter in each of our vertebrae that you'll learn about if you take anatomy. But another thing you'll learn in anatomy is lateral, anterior, and posterior. And so there's something called the lateral horn in our vertebrae. And this is where the nerves start branching off. So I'm going to draw this out just a little bit to help you understand. Okay, sweet. Okay, I'm going to show you this. This is where we're going to start. So this is our vertebrae. This is the lateral horn because it's on the lateral side. This is the sympathetic chain ganglia. This is above the diaphragm. This is the collateral ganglia, and this is below the diaphragm to kind of get you situated with where this is in our body. So I'm going to kind of just draw this out and talk a little bit about preganglionic and postganglionic. When I'm talking about preganglionic, that means it's the nerve before it gets into the ganglia or the sympathetic chain ganglia. Same with the collateral ganglia. Postganglionic, as you might be able to assume, is when the nerve leaves the ganglia and what it does. So I'm going to draw this out and use different colors to kind of help us understand what this is going to look like just a little bit. And I have a little paper that's kind of written down what I need to discuss today. So I'm kind of referring to that so that I don't forget anything. Okay, so from the lateral horn comes our first nerve that ends up in our sweat and our blood. So like our somatic nervous system controls all of those things. And so this nerve is myelinated. And I think we talked a little bit about that last time. But when this nerve ends, inside of the ganglia, it releases a neurotransmitter. I said that word before. A neurotransmitter, there's many different kinds of neurotransmitters. The ones that are released inside of the ganglia are almost always called acetylcholine. That's what we'll call the neurotransmitter. It's released into the ganglia. We're going to just call it ACH. This marker is not working very well with me. And this nerve is myelinated. So it kind of looks like that. And when it's myelinated, it increases the length constant, which sends these neurotransmitters down the neuron really quick to get to our sweat and our blood vessels and things like that. So when our brain tells us messages, we almost instantly know what we're trying to do and stuff like that. And so the next one, it's going to be post-ganglionic. It leaves the ganglia, and it is not myelinated, and so we're going to draw it dashed. And this releases another neurotransmitter outside of the ganglia, and it is not acetylcholine, but it's called norepinephrine. And this gets sent, like I said, into our sweat and blood vessels. This is above the diaphragm. Sweat and blood vessels above the diaphragm. Stuff like that. Releases norepinephrine into them. And now we're going to use a different color. Use blue this time. So this next one, it is called the sympathetic nerve. And it goes into our thoracic cavities. But it does pass through the sympathetic chain ganglia, as usual. And it also does release acetylcholine. We call that a synapse when it's releasing a neurotransmitter and starts another neuron throughout and gets sent to our body somewhere. And so this gets sent into our thoracic cavities. It's called the sympathetic nerve. I'm going to kind of draw this out quick. Thoracic cavities. And it also sends out norepinephrine into our thoracic cavities. So I kind of drew this quick. Goes from our lateral horn into the sympathetic chain ganglia, releases acetylcholine, goes again post-ganglionic, out of the ganglia, into the thoracic cavities, releases norepinephrine. Okay, and that is for the nerves above our diaphragm. Now, the next one I'm going to draw goes below the diaphragm, and I'll kind of explain it just a little bit. It does not release acetylcholine into the sympathetic chain ganglia, but it releases acetylcholine into the collateral ganglia. And then it goes post-ganglionic, or leaves the ganglia, and then enters the, I believe, abdominal cavities, releases norepinephrine into the abdominal cavities. Okay, that's kind of what that looks like. So it doesn't release anything above the diaphragm. Releases acetylcholine, then norepinephrine post-ganglionic into the abdominal cavities. For the final one, I think we might use blue again for this one, but we just need to keep track of which is which. It also comes down, passes through the sympathetic chain ganglia, doesn't release anything there. Also passes through the collateral ganglia, does not release any acetylcholine there, leaves the collateral ganglia into, believe it or not, the adrenal glands. Releases acetylcholine because the first synapse always releases acetylcholine. The second synapse releases norepinephrine usually. Now, once the acetylcholine is released into the adrenal gland, this is kind of like the afro above the kidney, it releases epinephrine outside of the adrenal gland, not norepinephrine, but just epinephrine into our blood. And any nerves below our diaphragm, we call the splenic nerves. Now don't get it mixed up with the splenic nerves. The splenic nerves are nerves that go to the spleen, but splenic nerves are nerves below our diaphragm that go through the collateral ganglia, if that makes a little bit of sense. So all in all, this is kind of what the nerve system looks like, above and below the diaphragm, kind of where that is. I'm going to refer back to my little piece of paper to kind of know where we're at so that I'm not skipping anything. Okay. Like I said, there's neurotransmitters, which are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Those are the main ones we're going to be using this week. But there are also different kinds of receptors. There is cholinergic and adrenergic, I believe. Adrenergic, yep. These are kind of big words, but adrenergic responds to the norepinephrine and epinephrine, like I was drawing earlier. It released post-ganglionic. And then the cholinergic responds to the other neurotransmitter, the acetylcholine, that releases preganglionic, or inside of the ganglia. And so those are kind of the differences between adrenergic and cholinergic receptors. They're kind of receptors that pick up the neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and norepinephrine and bring it into the neuron and sends it out of the ganglia, if that makes a little bit of sense. It might help to have some like biology class or anatomy class to understand a little bit more about these. And so to talk about the different subdivisions of each of these receptors, there's quite a few different subdivisions for cholinergic receptors. There's things called nicotinic receptors, which are like N2 receptors or nitrogen receptors. And those are found at the autonomic ganglia, or the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. And then there's muscarinic receptors. We usually call it, there's 5 muscarinic receptors, M1 through M5, and that's also under the subdivisions of cholinergic receptors. M1 is found in the central nervous system, so in the brain and spinal cord. M2 is found in the heart. M3 is found in smooth muscle glands, the endothelium, and then M4 and 5 are also mostly really found in the central nervous system, from what I know. And then the mechanisms of each of these receptors under cholinergic, there is the nicotinic receptors. They're inotropic, which basically means they are ligand-gated ligand-gated sodium-potassium channels. Like we talked, potassium wants to leave the cell, sodium wants to go in. That's kind of what inotropic receptors mean. But when acetylcholine binds, the channel opens, there's a sodium influx, like it goes in, depolarization happens in the cell, and that causes an action potential, which is stuff that we talked about last time a little bit. Then the mechanism of action under the cholinergic receptors for the muscarinic receptors, the M1 through M5 that I was talking about, they're metabotropic receptors. Basically, they control G proteins. And there's a long explanation for G proteins, but I would definitely look into that. There is M1 all the odd M's, so like M1, 3, and 5, the acetylcholine binds, activates the G protein, increases the calcium intake, and then there's contraction of muscles and things like that. And so those are kind of the actions of M1, 3, and 5. The actions of M2 and 4, still cholinergic. Acetylcholine binds to the ganglia, or not to the ganglia, excuse me, binds to the other neuron through the M2 and M4 because they are receptors. They pick up the neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. It lowers the CAMP levels and opens potassium channels and causes hyperpolarization, making the cell more negative. And then it's basically an inhibitory effect, which means it slows the heart rate. Inhibitory means slowing down. The location of each of these, like I drew out a little bit. Preganglionic are nicotinic receptors on postganglionic cell bodies. And then postganglionic under parasympathetic nervous system. Muscarinic receptors, the M1 through M5, are pretty much on the target organs, like the big ones, the heart, the smooth muscle, and our glands. For sympathetic nervous system, we have the preganglionic, that's like our nicotinic receptors in the sympathetic chain ganglia, the one that was above the diaphragm. And then postganglionic, it's kind of a special case for the sympathetic nervous system. It goes to sweat glands, uses the muscarinic receptors, like M3, even though it's part of the sympathetic system. Now, that's kind of for the cholinergic receptors. Adrenergic receptors, like I said, responds to norepinephrine or epinephrine that are postganglionic neurotransmitters. The subdivisions are alpha receptors and beta receptors. And so we have muscarinic receptors, nicotinic receptors, and alpha and beta receptors. There are two alpha receptors. The alpha 1 receptor is basically vascular, smooth muscle, blood vessels, and things like that. Alpha 2 is presynaptic terminals and some smooth muscle. And then we're getting into the beta receptors. Beta 1 is like heart, the SA node, the myocardium, like the outside of the heart, or the kidney. Beta 2 is smooth muscle, like lungs, bladder, uterus. Beta 3 is like adipose tissue, or the polycis, or like the bladder. And then the mechanisms of their actions a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about that for all the receptors. Alpha 1, norepinephrine binds, activates the G protein, increases calcium, and then smooth muscle contraction or I can't say the word, constriction. Vasoconstriction or like pupil dilation. And then A2 or alpha 2, the norepinephrine binds or epinephrine binds inhibits inhibits the CAMP and decreases norepinephrine release. And that creates negative feedback or good feedback on presynaptic terminals. Beta 1, 2, and 3 are like pretty similar. Norepinephrine and epinephrine binds. It activates the G's or G proteins, increases CAMP, and then activates protein kinase A or PKA. Beta 1 is basically on the heart, like I was saying earlier, raises heart rate, raises contractility, and then beta 2 is over the lungs, the vessels, and the uterus, and it relaxes your smooth muscle and your uterine relaxation. And beta 3 is kind of over the fat and your bladder, and that has lipolysis or bladder relaxation. And so, kind of to write it all out a little bit, nicotinic receptors receptors. Their system is either, it can be sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system. Oh, spell that wrong. They're like an ion channel for sodium and potassium. The effect is its depolarization at the ganglia. Then there's muscarinic 1 through 3, the odds. Wait, nope, yes, the odds. 1, 3, and 5, not 1 through 3. It's M1, M2, 3, M5. Sorry, it's been a long day. These are G proteins. They also increase calcium. The effect is like smooth muscle contraction, and this is in the parasympathetic nervous system mainly. Then there's muscarinic 2 and 4. These are also parasympathetic. It decreases CAMP and slows your heart rate, or inhibits your heart rate a little bit. This is also in PNS. I'm going to show you kind of what I'm writing. So there's nicotinic, can be either sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system. M1, 3, all the M's are mainly parasympathetic nervous system. Then we're going to get into the alpha and beta. Alpha 1, alpha 2. These are adrenergic. Like I said, they respond to norepinephrine, post-ganglionic. I spelled that. Chick. And these are over the sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system is over these different kinds of receptors. Alpha 1 increases calcium and is also a G protein. Alpha 2 is also a G protein, decreases CAMP, and decreases norepinephrine release. That's alpha 2. Alpha 1, the effect that it has is like pupil dilation. That's just one of the effects. And then is in the sympathetic nervous system, like I said. Okay. Then we have the betas, 1 through 3. These are the last ones. They are also adrenergic. All 3 of them are G proteins, and they all increase CAMP. Beta 1 increases your heart rate. Beta 2 is vasodilation, dilation of like smooth muscle and things like that. And beta 3 is like bladder relaxation. All of them are also in the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe I can also explain it in this way. So I kind of drew this out. These are the different receptors and kind of where they are when it comes to nervous system and kind of what they do a little bit. So if I can say this, alpha 1 is excitatory, alpha 2 is inhibitory, beta 1 is excitatory, beta 2 is inhibitory, beta 3 is excitatory. Muscarinic 1, 3, and 5 are excitatory. Muscarinic 2 and 4 are inhibitory. And like I said, inhibitory kind of means slow. I believe that was all that I had for today. And just a reminder, muscarinic is adrenergic, alpha and beta are adrenergic, and muscarinic is cholinergic. Responds to acetylcholine, according to the thing that we drew with all the colored lines. And so that was pretty much all that we learned for this week. Thanks for tuning in.